Hi everyone, Stepan here. In today's video I'm going to continue the series on the Dutch defense with the Leningrad Dutch, which is probably the most theory heavy and the most complicated of all the three Dutch systems, main Dutch systems, classical, Stonewall and Leningrad. So this is going to be a tough video to digest, I have to warn you. And I'll try to make it as simple as possible, but we have a lot of theory to go through. We also have a lot of sidelines to go through. Okay, so let's start. First of all, if you haven't seen the introductory video to the Dutch, please do. It will make this much simpler. So we are talking about the position you can see on the board. The Leningrad Dutch is a system in the Dutch defense in which black plays g6 and bishop to g7. Fianchettoing his bishop instead of leaving it on e7, as it does in the classical, or getting it either to e7 or d6 as black does in the stone wall. So most often in the classical, this bishop is going to want to come to f6 sometime in the middle game, but in the Leningrad the advantage is that the bishop is already on its most natural diagonal. Now what is the Dutch defense all about? When the opening starts, black plays the move pawn to f5. The move pawn to f5 does two things. The first thing is it controls two very important squares. It controls e4, which is the most natural square white would want to expand to seize control in the center. It also controls g4, which is a very important attacking square. It could often be used by a knight, especially from knight f6 to g4. The second thing f5 does, it prevents the natural e4 expansion, as already mentioned. The second thing it does, it weakens a lot of things in the black position. So firstly, it weakens this diagonal, which could often come in useful for white, as we are going to see in many variations of the Leningrad, with the queen being developed to b3 or the bishop coming to c4. The fact that black has moved his f-pawn is very significant. And the third, furthermore, it weakens the seventh rank. Whenever you move your f-pawn, your seventh rank is weak. It's weak whenever an infiltration happens on the 7th rank. And in the Dutch defense, white will often be playing on the queen side with a rook on c1. So your c7 pawn or c6 pawn will often be weak. And if a rook lands on c7, then the fact that you moved your f-pawn does become very, very significant. Okay, f5, the third thing it does, it provides great attacking chances. Firstly, getting your knight to f6 after you have moved your f-pawn is a big deal. This often happens in many d4 openings where white plays c4 and then knight c3. This pawn is now a force to be reckoned with, as opposed to being stuck on f7. More attacking chances come with the fact that black can move this pawn forward, and then, especially in fianchetto structures, which white most often employs against the Dutch, this becomes very important. Okay, so let's get into the Leningrad Dutch. c4 by white, knight f6 by black, g3 by white. This is the most common way to fight against the Dutch, because the Dutch is a light squared strategic opening for black. Black wants to control the light squares, so white naturally deploys his bishop to g2. And black plays the move g6. Now, the Leningrad Dutch starts as soon as you play g6 because it's a system and the move order is not as important. So g6 provides you with the option to play bishop to g7. It also further weakens your king side. It also does provide more attacking chances, making other pawn moves easier to play and harder for white to face. White plays bishop to g2, black plays bishop to g7, white plays knight to f3, black castles, white castles, black plays d6. Now, the reason why I play d6 is firstly because as soon as white fianchettos, you don't have time for b6, bishop b7. So you want to be opening up your bishop on this diagonal. As opposed to the classical Dutch, when you have a pawn on e6, this bishop is much easier to develop. The second reason why you play d6 is that black wants to expand in the center with the move e5. Now let's talk about the similarities between the King's Indian and the Leningrad Dutch. This is the most important theoretical nuance you have to understand. These two openings are very similar. The strategies behind the two openings are very similar. The only difference in the structure for now is that the pawn is not on f7, it's on f5. If the pawn were on f7, this would be a King's Indian structure for black. So there are upsides and downsides, of course. Firstly, the King's Indian is an opening in which white has a ton more space. And that happens because white plays e4 easily. As soon as black plays f5, that means white doesn't have the option of playing e4 without consequences. Secondly, in the King's Indian, you often want to play the move f5 so that you can start an attack. To do that, you either have to play knight h5, knight e8, or knight d7. You basically have to move your knight. In the Leningrad Dutch, you've already moved your f-pawn, so that's a big advantage. As opposed to the King's Indian, though, white has a lot more option against this, and the black king is already weakened, so black doesn't have his normal defensive options, which he does in the King's Indian. Basically, the idea of the Leningrad Dutch is to get a favorable King's Indian to tempi up, because you did not have to play knight h5, f5. You had time to do something else. Okay, and white plays knight to c3. This is the standard attacking position for black, the standard starting position of the Leningrad Dutch. White plays in a very normal fashion, sort of a Catalan structure with the bishop on g2. All of his pieces are perfectly well developed. Okay, before we get into the main lines, and after the main lines we are going to be going over the sidelines, I just want to mention a few things that white could do before we get into that. Okay, so the first thing is there are a ton of gambits you have to be aware of as black that white could play. These I'm not going to be covering in detail in this video because I'm going to be making a separate video on each one, but basically white is able to play e4, which is the Staunton gambit. White is able to play g4, which is the Krejcik gambit. White is able to play knight c3, which is the Raphael variation. White is able to play bishop g5, which is the Hopton attack. He also has the option of playing bishop f4, for example, and there are a ton of sidelines which could basically get you out of your comfort zone. So if you want to play the Leningrad Dutch, know that it's nearly impossible to guarantee that you actually will have it on the board. So those are the first deviations. There's nothing you can do about that. If white plays d4 and you play f5, then maybe he doesn't go for the main lines. The second thing I would like to mention are positions without d4. Okay, so if white starts, for example, with c4 or knight to f3, then the positions are not going to be the same, obviously. If at any point white does play the move pawn to d4, then you are going to transpose. If not, you are either going to get into an English opening by transposition, or you will get weird gambits, which I'm going to show you in a second. So you play your normal f5, and there are two main options for white in this position. The first one is d3, leading to a very interesting gambit option. The second one is e4, gambiting a pawn straight away. This is the Lysine Gambit. Lysine was a great Russian theoretician. He actually wrote my favorite tactics books. Georgy Mikhailovich Lysine is his full name, and he was a great tactical player. So e4, it makes a lot of sense to have it named after him. The idea is you can take once, but you don't have control over the center anymore. So as soon as the f5 pawn is gone, you have all the downsides of having played f5 and no upsides. All of that for the cost of one pawn, which is going to be returned for white. So e4 is a very strong move. White plays knight to g5, black continues knight to f6, and white plays the move pawn to d3. Now, there is a principled way to play this variation. It's still very hard to play, so learn this by heart. Before we get into the main lines of the Leningrad, learn this. If you take the pawn, you're basically busted. Okay, so white plays the move bishop takes d3. He has everything in this position. A great knight, a great bishop, a great queen ready to come in. Your f7 pawn is gone. You have one piece developed. White can castle, or he can play stronger moves. So let me just give you an example of a horrible mistake you could make. If you play knight c6, which is seemingly a natural move, then bam, knight takes h7. Now, if you don't want to well, lose, let's say you take the knight. Now this is mate in 1, so you cannot really take the knight. If you take with the rook, then I take with the bishop, fine, and I'm just too much material up. If you take back, then queen check, checkmate, actually. So you have to be wary about these things. So after bishop takes d3, the only way to actually save your position, even though it's already busted, would be to play g6. So just remember that after e4, the Lysine Gambit, you take once, but you don't take the second time after d3. The move you play is pawn to e5. And after d takes e4, white got his pawn back, you start developing and get ready to castle quickly. Now here's the issue, white can stop you from doing that. He plays bishop c4. There's nothing you can do about this. And bishop f7 check is coming, whatever you do. The best move is queen e7, bishop f7 check, king to f8, the bishop drops back to d3, to b3 because you were threatening h6, so h6. Knight back to f3 and d6. The engines say black is fine in this position, equal or slightly better. So this is the best you can get. After knight c3, g5, h4, g4, something like knight g1 and g3, bishop g4. I can see why the engines like black, but I can also see why no human would enjoy this position with actually either color. So if you play knight f3 with white, that's an interesting option against the Dutch. Learn the Lysine Gambit, it's very strong. The second option is pawn to d3, and after pawn to d6, pawn to e4, another sort of gambit offer. So the principled move here is e5, which we are going to get to in a second, opening up your bishop. But if you get greedy and play f takes e4, then d takes e4, knight to f6, e5 leads to extremely strong positions for white. And in this position, white is, of course, offering a pawn. So d takes e5, queen takes d8, king takes d8, knight takes e5, and excuse me, he's not offering a pawn, he's offering to ruin your position. So nobody would want to play this, don't play this. After e4, you simply play e5, and after knight c3, knight f6, normal development, ef5, bishop f5, this is fine. d4, trying to break open your center, but now e4. Knight h4, attacking the bishop attacks the queen, bishop to e2, you take, takes, and d5, and the position goes on from here. So d3 is not as scary as the Lysine Gambit, but it's still scary. Okay, one more thing. Before we get to the main lines, if white avoids positions with pawn to g3 after d4, f5, there are again a couple of options he could play. There are the gambit lines, and there are numerous variations I'm going to be covering in separate videos. But the main thing is, if white plays normal moves without g3, let's say c4, let's say g6, knight c3, bishop to g7, e3, then you will want to fianchetto your other bishop. If he doesn't go for one of the sub-variations, but plays a dubious system without g3, then fianchetto your other bishop. Alright, now let's get into the options black could go for. So starting from this position, the main line, there are two main moves. The first move is pawn to c6, the Warsaw variation. The second move is queen to e8. There are other moves, and I'm going to be covering them, but these are the two main options. Now let's talk about what each does. The move pawn to c6, the Warsaw variation, is the safest move. It's safe for two reasons. Firstly, it blocks this bishop. Secondly, it makes d5 much harder to play, which is a move white often plays. Furthermore, it gives your knight a very good square on c7, and often the b8 knight doesn't have a good square to develop to. If you play knight to d7, then you block in your bishop, and as we said, it's very hard to play b6, bishop b7. And the move queen e8 does three things. Firstly, most importantly, it supports the e5 break, which is something black would like to achieve in the Leningrad Dutch. You want to expand. It controls the queen side, In the Dutch defense, same as against the King's Indian, white will often play b4, b5, expand on the queen side. This sort of dampens that a bit. And the third and the most popular reason why people play queen e8 is that you can play moves like queen e7, queen g6, or queen h5. Excuse me, as soon as your g-pawn has moved, which supports a kingside attack. In fact, after, let's say, rook to e1 and queen f7, which is the most popular move, now moves like f4 become much more interesting, much more dangerous. The c4 pawn is attacked, so white is provoked to do something. So that's queen e8. The other options include knight to c6, which is the so-called Matulovich Variation. He was one of the best Yugoslav grandmasters in the 60s, 70s. He was in the Olympic team. The idea behind this move is to develop your knight as soon as possible. The problem is it provokes the move pawn to d5, and this is the old way to play. Now we have two options, knight e5 or knight a5. We are going to be discussing both of them. Other moves instead of knight to c6, queen e8, or c6 are pawn to e6, which again fights to prevent the move d5, and sort of compromises because you want to play e5 later on. e6 could be argued is a waste of tempo, and knight a6. This sort of makes queen c2 a redundant move because knight b4. It also prepares either c6 or c5 to get your knight to c7 and to control the center. So these are the moves we are going to be looking at in detail. After we finish those, I'm going to show you a very interesting weapon for white, which not many people know about. Now, first of all, let's get into the main line. So d4, pawn to f5, c4, knight f6, g3, g6, bishop g2, bishop g7, knight f3, castles, castles, d6, knight c3, queen e8. Let's start with the main move. Now, there are a ton of options for white, unfortunately. We have pawn to d5, which is the main move. We have b3, we have knight d5, we have queen b3, we have pawn to e4, and we have rook to e1. So if you play queen e8, you have to know a lot of theory. d5 is the main move, so let's leave that for last. I'm going to start with the move rook e1, which seems to be gaining a lot of popularity recently, and it's supposed to be the most aggressive move. The idea behind rook e1 is that white wants to achieve central control, which he doesn't have at the moment by playing the move pawn to e4. Rook e1 simply supports that 1, 2 defenders, 1, 2 attackers, and you can play e4. Queen f7, as I said, attacking the c4 pawn, supporting the queen side, preparing to launch a kingside attack. Pawn to b3 defending. Of course, the most natural square for the c1 bishop is b2. There's no better diagonal. Sometimes knight g5 or bishop g5 or bishop f4 or bishop h6 can be played, but that's quite rare. Okay, and now I'm not going to go over all the options for black at each point. Here you don't really have an option, there's only one move, but most often I'm going to be recommending what I think are the best lines. Here the best thing you can do is play knight e4. The reason why I play knight e4, and if you've seen my video on the classical Dutch, you will already be familiar with this pattern, is once you play knight e4, it's very hard to play e4 for white. So knight e4 stops that. With the queen and rook on this lovely diagonal, taking the knight would lose straight away. As you can see, wherever the knight goes, you're going to take on f2 and win the game. So knight e4 actually cannot be taken. That's why it's the best move. Black plays bishop to b2, and you continue developing knight to c6. Now, in this position, if white plays d5, that opens the diagonal for both bishops. For the moment, it would lose material because you can take, and if bishop takes, then bishop takes, winning an exchange. And if pawn takes knight, then you take the queen. So d5 cannot be played straight away. However, this pattern should be noted and should be remembered. The good thing is that you have two defenders on e5. So even if d5 can be played under favorable circumstances, you have knight e5. Okay, so white continues with rook c1, defending, preparing to play the move d5, making it much more reasonable. And black does what he set out to do. The reason why you play knight c6 is you want to play e5, you want to expand, so e5. White responds with d5, and you have a couple of options with the knight. a5 is not a good not a good move. D8 or E7 aren't that good either. The theory says you should play knight b4. This is a tough move to play if you don't know why, because you can see that a3 is coming. But the reason is you can simply take on c3, and after, excuse me, rook takes on c3, you can play knight a6. Now, the reason why knight a6 is a good move is because later on you will have the option to play knight to c5, or you can undermine the structure with c6, undermining this weak d5 pawn, which is overextended, and then continue with knight c7, attacking the d5 weakness. White plays b4. Fine, if b5 is played, you have knight c5, no issues there. So e4, attacking the rook, knight to d4, bishop to d7, finally developing your bishop, queen to d2, rook a to e8, and your development is finally complete. And now you can see why you played queen f7. Now you can see why the goal was to push through with e5. Now you can see why your bishop is good on g7. All of your pieces stand well. Sometimes f4 will be a very strong threat. In this position, if white doesn't prevent f4 very directly, let's say white plays a stupid move, I don't know, let's say a4, let's pretend that black doesn't take, then f4 by black is a move that already completely destroys white's position. For example, if takes, then queen takes, rook takes, white's king is completely open. Both of your bishops are now working. The bishop is coming to e5, the rook is coming to h4, the other rook could come to f8. This is basically all over. So f4, as you can see, is a very strong threat from black. All of your pieces are perfectly placed for a kingside attack. That's the reason why white has to play f4 himself. And you don't want to have a closed position, so you take en passant, ef3, rook f3, and bishop to e5. And again, all of your pieces are lovely. White has a weakness on e2, and sometimes sacrifices are going to work. Sometimes f4 will work, for example, here. Sometimes you can break open the bind on the d5 pawn. So that's rook e1. A very interesting move going for e4, but if black knows what he is doing, then it doesn't really give white a big advantage. Okay, now let's continue with e4. That's the most straightforward move. e4 simply breaks open the position, gives up a pawn temporarily, so you have to take. Whenever white plays e4, you take it, basically. So fe4, knight g5, preparing to return the pawn, 1, 2, 3 attackers, and there's basically no way to save the pawn. So you continue with knight c6. White plays the move bishop e3, defending the d4 pawn, which could be under pressure after, for example, if takes, then the pawn drops. Okay, so bishop e3 defending the pawn, and now here's the point. You play e5, breaking open the position. If white ever takes on e5, then you take back with the knight, putting pressure on c4. Your e6 square is not a weakness, as we are going to see often is, and very good position. So after e5, as white, you have to remember to play d5. Always play d5 if black plays e5. This gives your knight a very good outpost on e6, which will either force black to give up his bishop pair or cause even more trouble. Okay, bishop g4, attacking the queen. Queen drops, goes up to d2, and now knight to d4. Your knight was attacked, so you have to move it. And this pawn sacrifice is actually perfectly sound, because your bishop is no good with a pawn on e5, and if you open up the diagonal, there could be trouble. Also, white cannot really afford to leave the knight on d4, so he takes, queen takes. And now the most theoretical move is bishop to f5, simply defending the pawn once more, and rook a to e1. And from here on, the positions are very interesting. You can see that there are a lot of attacking prospects for black, both on the queen side and on the king side. White has more space. Black has this weak pawn on e5, but for the moment there's not much that can be done about it, because there are nice discoveries with knight g4 and knight h4 and knight takes d5 sometimes. But yeah, very double-edged position, which the engine gives is better for white, but not much better. So this is what you do against pawn to e4. Now let's continue. Let's have a look at queen to b3. Queen b3 is the most straightforward move. The first thing you should note is that this exploits the weakness of f5 immediately. So if you play e5, ignoring what white is doing, then c5 check is very good for white. If you block with the bishop, then queen takes b7. If you block with the queen, then queen takes and bishop takes, and white gets an enormous position. Attacks your bishop, the bishop drops back, you had to defend because b7 was weak, and now d takes e5, d takes e5, and knight d5 is just crushing. So you basically have no good way to defend. You can take, but then it's with check, and then knight e6 or knight f7 are coming. So let me just show you that. So here, 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 and here, and that would be game over. Or you can, after d5, knight d5, play knight a6, which defends, but this is a sorry position all the same. So after the move queen to b3, you don't really want to ignore what he is doing, so you can do two things. The best move is knight a6, simply preventing what white is doing with your knight, as we are going to see, simply defending the c7 pawn, so there will be no attacks on the a8 rook. You can play c6 to meet c5 with d5, or you can play king h8, which is the safest. Knight a6 is the best move, so let's have a look at that. All right, so bishop g5 attacks your knight, c5, preventing c5. This is a very strong move. You can also play d5, but c5 is stronger. Bishop takes knight, bishop takes bishop, rook a to d1, and now bishop back to g7, dropping your bishop back, pawn to e3, defending d4, king h8, getting away from the diagonal, and finally d5. And this is a position you're going to be facing if white plays pawn to queen to b3. You get your knight back to c7, and the idea is basically to play a6, b5, or b5 straight away if you can, and delay e6 if you can, because that would give white a lot of attacking pressure. In this position, you actually switch your attention back to the queen side. If white plays a passive move like rook e1, then it's possible to give up your bishop, but your king is on h8, so that comes with check. But sometimes it's possible to give up your bishop to force through b5. That would terminally weaken the d5 pawn. Alternatively, a6, a4, rook b8, a5 comes, and now you have to find a way to play b5. But that's your goal. Okay, so that's queen b3. Now let's have a look at two other moves, knight d5 and b3. If knight d5 is played, this I think is the most pleasant position for black. I have no issues with this. When knight d5 is played, you take it. That's the first thing you have to remember. And then you play queen to b5. There are alternatives, but I would recommend queen to b5. You can play knight d7 or c6 or even h6, but queen b5 is the most active move. And now there's a bit of shuffling to do. Knight to g5, using the weakness on e6 provided by the d5 pawn. c6, you have to break open this bind straight away. a4 attacks your queen, queen b6, a5 attacks your queen, queen b5. Let me just note that you cannot win this pawn. If you play queen takes d4, then queen to b3, avoiding the trade, and if you try something like c5, then of course knight e6 comes and you are in trouble. If you don't play c5, then let's say you play, I don't know, knight d7, then of course takes, and that's with check, and again you simply lose. So after a5, don't take on d4, play the queen back to b5. White breaks open the position with e4, and now cd5, ed5, knight a6, again the same idea, putting pressure on the d5 pawn. Even though white has this great bind in the center, after knight d5, cd5, these pawns are weak. a5 is weak, d5 is weak, d4 is weak, b2 is weak, everything is weak. The only good thing white has going for himself is the e6 square. If you manage to undermine that, then he doesn't have it anymore. However, it's white to move, and rook e1 puts pressure on you straight away. You defend with bishop f6, rook a3, getting the other rook into play, bishop to d7, rook to b3 attacks your queen, queen to a4, rook takes on b7. All of this has been played a ton of times, and queen takes queen, rook takes queen, bishop c8, defending everything, rook to b3, bishop back to d7, and now rook d to d3, rook d to d3 defending. It's a complicated position and you could lose with black, but my experience is that this is much easier to play for black than for white, especially for players who are not used to playing for dynamic play as white in this position, because you have to play dynamically. Statically, you're just lost. Your pawn structure is dreadful. So knight d5 is not something to fear after queen e8. Now let's look at b3. b3 is a slightly passive move, which, I mean, it's still good. Your bishop goes to b2, but it allows pawn to e5 without punishment. Okay, so now d5 would give black a great position, so you exchange as white, d5, d5, and pawn to e4. That's the point. In this position, you don't really want to take. That wouldn't be good, because knight g5 and the pawn is going to be regained and your e5 pawn is going to be weak. So the point is you play knight to c6, trying to control d4, trying to control b4, developing your pieces, preparing to connect your rooks. If he takes, you can take with the pawn if you are a King's Indian aggressive player, or you could take with the bishop. Taking with the bishop is slightly more sound. Okay, but white plays knight to d5 and now queen to d7, offering a queen trade. And now this leads to a queen sack line in which black gives up the queen for 2 pieces. This line you just have to learn. This is the best black can do against b3. So if you play the Leningrad, focus that this is going to be tough. Okay, bishop a3 attacks your rook. Rook to d8 defends your queen. Queen to c2 declines the queen trade if the knight moves. Remember, knight f6 is still with check. Okay, knight takes, knight takes e4. Okay, rook a to d1, looking at your queen, and now you have to be careful. You don't really have a good alternative to king h8, which is the main move, because your position is otherwise going to crumble. White has too many pieces ready to come in. So you play king h8 to make sure knight f6 is not with check. But knight f6 comes anyway. After knight f6, you have nothing better but to go for a queen sacrifice. And this is good for black. If you don't go for this, if you move your queen, then knight takes e4 and your position crumbles. So for example, queen e7, knight e4, pawn e4, queen e4, and not queen e7, because the bishop could take, let's say, queen to e6. Knight e4, pawn e4, queen e4, and white is simply winning. So after knight to f6, you play bishop takes f6. White takes your queen. You take with the bishop, don't block in your bishop. And now you have a bishop and rook for the queen. It's supposed to be equal, but I think black's position is easier to play, because it's not easy to break through to the black king, and black has a ton of minor pieces to play with. The bishop drops back to b2, the bishop drops back to e8. This opens up your rook, prepares rook to d2 if white is uncareful. a3 preventing the bishop coming back to b4 and preparing b4. And now a5 stopping b4, h4, and white has to go for an attack, but I believe black is quicker. Rook e1, you can continue with rook d8, and I like this position for black. It's a queen sack line, but it's the best you can do, and don't be afraid to give up your queen. Okay, so that's b3. Now finally, let's have a look at the main line, d5. After d5, there are a couple of options. You can play a5 or knight a6. I would recommend knight a6. After knight a6, white has 3 moves. I know this is too much theory, but I'm sorry, there's no way to cover the Leningrad Dutch in a simpler way. White can play knight d4, which is the main move. White can play bishop to e3, or white can play rook b1. Rook b1 is simple to understand, preparing a queenside expansion. Bishop to d7 and b4, of course, and c6, stopping b5 and giving your knight the c7 square. d6, b6, a3 defending the pawn, and knight c7, I think is a fairly pleasant position for black. As soon as you move your rook away to d8, there will be no issues on this diagonal. More importantly, the bishop will be staring at nothing. So bishop b2, knight to e6 is the main move. c5, d5, Knight to e5, fine, you have a great square, but after rook d8, if black can achieve the e5 break, and having transferred his pieces to the king side, he will have a very strong position. Of course, if you waste time, then a4, b5, and one of those pawns is going to queen. So let me just give you a sample bad variation for black. So let's say you play, I don't know, h6, b4, let's say king h7, and then here and takes, and this is very hard to stop. So you could be losing in a matter of a few moves if you're not careful, so pay attention to the queenside expansion. The other move after knight a6 is bishop e3, which is a lot less straightforward, simply controlling the dark squares. Bishop to d7, queen d2, knight g4 attacks the bishop. The bishop goes up to f4, and knight c5, transferring your knight into the middle and challenging the e4 square. h3, knight f6, bishop h6, offering a bishop trade, which is a very rare thing in the Leningrad Dutch. Knight c4, knight takes, f takes, getting rid of this knight. And after the knight moves, the knight will often go to d4, which is the best square. Now you have ideas like queen f7 and e3. And for example, takes, queen takes, pawn to e3. Maybe it's not good now because queen takes, but this is a pattern you want to remember, because if fe3, then everything becomes much weaker. Also, after queen f7, you already have pressure on f2. So that's bishop to e3, which I wouldn't recommend for white. And the main move is knight to d4. This is what you have to know best. You continue with bishop d7. These squares are very weak, you want to be covering them. Rook to b1, again going for queenside play. c6, again preventing b5, giving your knight the c7 square and undermining the center. And now b3, preparing bishop b2. Okay, knight c7, getting the knight back. Bishop to b2 and c5. You couldn't play c5 in one move because dc5. And now after knight c2, again supporting the b4 square, you continue with b5. And you sort of challenge white on the side of the board where he wants to attack. You sort of put pressure on the queen side yourself. cb, knight b, bishop b, and again, positionally not great for black. I don't think you have too much in this position. I would much rather be white, but it's active. And if you can get in g5, f4, queen f7, put pressure on d5, the g2 bishop is not as good. Perhaps trading off the b2 bishop will give you some advantage on the king side, and because your king will not be under pressure from the bishop. Maybe you can stop the queen side play with a5, a4, undermine the structure. So it's not bad, but it's not easy. Okay, so that was d5. Now, let's switch to the Warsaw variation. Okay, after knight c3, if you don't play queen e8, your second best is c6. Now again, a lot of options for white. d5 is the main move. Then you have b3, you have rook b1, you have queen c2, you have rook e1, you have queen b3, and you have b4. Okay, let's start with b4. b4 expands on the queen side, prepares to undermine c6. c6, as I said, is the strongest, is the safest move because it blunts this bishop and makes d5 harder to play. You continue with e5, d5, d5, and white plays e4. Now, in this position, trading of the queens is beneficial for black. After takes, you continue with f4. Now, you don't have a very strong attack while your queen is traded off, but you still have an attack stronger than white's attack because white has no attack. What white has going for himself is queenside pressure, and maybe that's useful. White continues rook b1, fg3, fg3, rook to e8, defending your pawn, pawn to h3, stopping knight g4, and now bishop e6. If knight takes e5, then knight takes e4. So both sides have weaknesses, both sides have advantages, both bishops are bad, the g2 and the g7 bishop. It's a balanced position. Queen b3 after c6 shouldn't be met with knight c6 because you cannot play knight c6. Instead you play king h8. Now white continues rook d1, supporting d5. And one thing you have to remember, when d5 comes, you play c5. Okay, knight a6. Queen to a3, which supports b4 and the further expansion. Knight c7, the knight drops back. D5, c5, and now rook b1, again supporting b4. And here's a nice move. You play knight to h5. This prevents b4 for a second and also makes it easier to get your queen into play if the knight moves, makes f4 stronger, makes f4 possible actually. So these positions I like for black. I think the white queen is offside and playing queen b3 is kind of risky, because if white doesn't get his queenside play going, the queen is doing nothing. Okay, rook e1 is the next move I want to look at. Again, preparing e4. In this position, it's not necessary to prevent that immediately, because you have a square for your knight and you can play in the center. So knight a6, b3, preparing bishop b2, queen c7, supporting e5, bishop a3, knight e4. Again, when you play knight e4, it's hard to play e4. Queen c2, this we know from the classical Dutch, prepares to take. So as soon as queen c2 is played with your knight on e4, you take. And queen takes. And again, a balanced position in which c5 could cause problems for white because of this diagonal. Generally, your bishop is better than white's bishop. Generally, you want to play e5. Again, a balanced position. Here I would like to have black. The next move is queen to c2. Again, supporting e4. Again, we respond with knight a6. White plays a3, preparing b4. And now queen e8. And this I'm not going to be showing you in detail because we've covered this in the queen e8 line. White expands with b4, you respond with e5. Basically, whenever white plays on the queen side, the good response is to break in the center with e5. Because b4 wastes time, you have time for e5. D takes, e4, again, we've seen this before, responded to with f4. Bishop to b2, knight h5, we've seen this too, and knight e2. And this is probably one of the most aggressive setups for black, which white allows with queen c2. Okay, after c6, white could also play rook b1. Again, it's about getting that queenside counterplay going. If rook b1 is played, you just stop that with a5, queen b3, again, getting some pressure on your king. In this position, h6 is a good move because it stops knight g5, prevents any trouble on f7, and also if c5, you can play king h7. Rook d1, knight a6, a3, knight c7, we've seen all of this before, and d5. And in this position, you don't actually play c5, you play bishop to d7, because if white takes, it gets rid of the control over e6, your b7 pawn is defended, and the g2 bishop is challenged. So this would be very good. And after, bishop d7, d takes c6, bc6 is also an option, after which queen c2 is played, but I would recommend taking with the bishop. I think that's slightly better. All right. And before we get to the main move, let's have a look at b3. Again, b3 is slightly passive, but natural. Knight a6, bishop to b2, queen to c7, supporting e5, d5. In this position, since e5 has been supported, you can play e5 instead of c5. Okay, of course, white should take, d takes e6, bishop takes e6, knight g5 attacks your bishop. Bishop drops back to d7 and queen to d2, connecting the rooks. After rook a d8, I believe black is slightly better in this position. The only thing white has going for himself is pressure on d6 and this knight on g5, but often this knight can be driven away easily with the move h6, and I think this is a very pleasant position. This is a Dutch without positional consequences, so b3 I wouldn't recommend for white. Okay, now d5, the main move. d5, and it may be counterintuitive, but we respond to this with e5. Again, if the c6 pawn is taken, no problem. If the e6 pawn is taken, then bishop takes. Okay, b3, again, knight a6, again, bishop to b2. You are going to remember all of these lines because they are all similar, and at least you are going to remember the plans. Queen e7. Knight g5 attacks your bishop, the bishop drops back to d7, this is a common pattern. Queen d2 preparing rook d1, rook a d8 defending the pawn in anticipation of rook a d1, and after rook a d1, bishop c8. This is just this setup with the other queen on d7 or e7 and the bishop on c8, knight on a6, rook on d8, rook on f8, bishop on g7 and the knight on f6 is what you're going to be facing in most Leningrad games. Rook fe1, normal continuation, h6 as I said, driving the knight away. The knight goes back to h3 because now g6 is weak, and you continue with knight c5, getting your knight into play and fighting for e4. And could a position be more pleasant than this? This is the main line of the Warsaw, and study games from this position. There are some games you could study. They are all about the e4 square and about the kingside pressure for black, without white having any counterplay on the queen side yet. You have a weak d6 pawn. If you can get rid of it, fine. If not, defend it, and I just like these positions. Okay, so that was queen e8 and pawn to c6. Now let's have a look at the Matulovich variation, the old main line, knight c6. Knight c6 is very provocative. I wouldn't recommend it, but I'm going to show you what to do with it just briefly. After d5, which is the most sensible response, knight e5 I wouldn't recommend, because knight e5, d5, queen b3 gives white, I think, a great position. You have to stop bishop g5, so h6, rook d1, and g5. The idea is basically white is playing on the queen side, you're playing on the king side, and if you don't win with these pawns, then you're going to lose with these pawns. So knight e5, very risky. Instead of that, knight a5 is a much more sensible move. Here, the most obvious move, queen a4, attacking the knight, can be met with c5. And after dc6, you play knight c6, so your knight is not misplaced. After knight a5, if knight d2 is played, which simply defends the c4 pawn as well as queen a4, then you still continue with c5, and after queen to c2, then you play e5, and you have a sort of closed check-Benoni structure, but white could take, so takes and bishop takes, and after b3, knight c6, these squares are extremely weak, and white wants to play e4, remember. So if e4, let's say e4 is played, that would be a disaster because of knight d4. So both of these moves not challenging. Knight a5 may seem funny, but it's a good move. The main move is actually queen to d3, defending the c4 pawn. Again, against this, you continue with c5. So just remember c5. b3, a6, preparing b5 at some point, bishop to b2, rook to b8, preparing b5. The Matulovich variation is going to be Dutch/Benoni instead of Dutch/King's Indian, which you may or may not like. I don't like it. Excuse me. Rook b1. Bishop d7, knight to d2, again opening up the bishop, preparing e4. Black gets in b5. White plays bishop a1, preparing to open up his rooks, and now knight to g4. And this is a combination of kingside pressure and queenside play. e3, as I said, you want to defend the square. The knight comes to e5, the queen drops back to e2, b takes c4, b takes c4, rook b4. You're playing for an extra pawn on the queen side, so if this is taken, you have a pawn majority, the knight is coming to c5, and you play a5, a4, b3, and queen. But that's not really going to happen after rook b4, white doesn't have to take. You have weaknesses, white's king is safer, white's pawn structure is more solid. I don't know. For dynamic players, this is good. But again, the Matulovich variation, I wouldn't choose it instead of the main lines. Okay, now let's have a look at e6. This is another sideline. Let's just glance at it briefly. Queen c2, knight c6, e6 before d5, knight c6 to prevent d5, rook d1, preparing d5, queen e7, and d5. And in this position, knight b4, because queen c2 has been played, queen to b3, knight drops back to a6, d takes e6. Here you can play bishop e6 straight away, but knight c5 is stronger, queen c2 and bishop takes e6. I don't see a reason for black to play this way. If you want to, you can. It's not a bad move, e6, but this bishop seems stronger. Oh, fine, you haven't played c6, so d6 is not weak, but you have a different set of issues. b4 is easy to play once c4 is defended. So I don't know. And the final move I would like to mention is the move knight a6 immediately. This could be used to confuse your opponents. White should play rook b1 and now c6, b4, knight c7, b5 is not prevented, but white continues queen b3 first, king h8, getting away from the queen, rook d1. Now white has a lot to look forward to, but there's this move, which you don't normally see in the Leningrad, bishop e6, which makes everything white wants to do harder to do. So after b5, cb5, you can never take with the c-pawn, knight b5, knight b5, queen b5. By taking with the queen, white has weakened himself on c4. So after rook b8, something like bishop e3 should be played and bishop g8. Black, I think, stands better, so this is a good surprise weapon. But this move, bishop e6, is very anti-Leningrad, so I don't know. Even though you get good positions, this is sort of out of the system. So remember that knight a6 is an anti-Leningrad move, even though it's played in most other variations. Now, the final thing I would like to go over is one very nice variation for white, which avoids everything we just saw. The reason why I saved this for last is if you're a player who plays d4, then this is worth remembering. So d4, f5, knight f3, knight f6, you're not playing c4. So g3, g6, you play your normal stuff, bishop g2, bishop g7, castles, castles. Notice that white hasn't played c4. Knight b to d2, d6, you play your normal stuff, and rook to e1. With his move rook e1, white prepares e4, after which the rook will be very active along the e file. Yeah, and I have to say again, white hasn't played c4, which means he can restrict your Leningrad bishop with the move c3. So those two things change the nature of the position. Okay, after rook e1 you have a couple of options. You can play knight e4, knight c6, knight h5, d5 or c6. I'm only going to go over what I think is the best move, what is actually the main line. You can study the other moves yourselves. So knight c6. After knight c6, d5 of course doesn't work because he hasn't played c4 yet. So that's the upside of white not having played c4. So after knight c6, white plays e4, which he'd been preparing. Now your response is f takes, and after knight takes, you take with the knight. And after rook takes, you play bishop f5. Okay, so this is the way to punish this variation. After bishop f5, the rook drops back to e1 and you break through with e5. Taking, of course, wouldn't be good because takes, even if you lose a pawn. This would be devastating for white. The black pieces are extremely active, and for a cost of one pawn, that's basically nothing. It's hard to develop this bishop, hard to defend the king, hard to develop this rook, hard to play b3. He already has a tempo on the bishop, so this wouldn't be good. Instead of that, after e5, bishop g5 should be played, and now bishop f6, you don't mind the trade. Bishop h6, rook e8, d5, d5, pawn to c3 defending the diagonal, and queen d6. I think this is a pleasant position for black. I don't think white has anything, so that's the way to fight this setup. I'm just going to show you one more move after rook e1, which I think is interesting, and that's knight h5. So here is why, and this probably I would play this in a tournament game instead of knight c6, even though knight c6 is objectively better. Why? Because black is ready to meet e4 with f4. One very simple reason. He is preparing to get a nice King's Indian in without having to waste the tempo on f5 because he already played f5. So for example, e4, f4, e5, d5, d5, and bishop g4 gives you great attacking chances. If white doesn't know what he is doing, he could lose in a matter of moves. Okay, so yeah, this is what I would like to finish the video with. Sorry if this was too much theory. I know it was too much theory. Watch the video a couple of times. I hope you got something from it. Hope I managed to explain at least 1% of the Leningrad Dutch. As always, if you have any questions, comment below, I will try to answer. And thanks for watching. Stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.